Voy a dar una semblanza del doctor Jürgen Kahler. Desde abril del 99 es profesor de Economics and the University Erlangen del Nuremberg. Ha estudiado jornalismo en the Cologne School, en el Instituto of Journalism, and at the same time Economics and the University of Cologne. Ha recibido el diploma en Ciencias Sociales en Análisis de Datos de la Universidad de Essex, en Reino Unido. Después ha trabajado en estudios en la Universidad como asistente de la Universidad de Colonia, en finanzas públicas, en la Universidad de Mannheim, en temas econométricos. De 91 a 94 trabajó en el Centro de Estudios Europeos, Investigación de Estudios Europeos, como investigador en el Departamento de Mercados Financieros y Finanzas Empresariales. Después fue lector en estudios de estadísticos y director del curso de Master Business Administration de Finanzas Gerenciales de la Universidad de Exeter por 5 años, y en 1995 recibió el PhD in Economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science, y el nombre de su tesis fue Stochastic Model of Exchange Rate Dynamics and the Implication for Pricing of Foreign Currency Option. El profesor Keller es investigador asociado en the CUCEA, y he has visited professor at the University of Exeter and the University of KwaZulu-Natal, en Durban, en Sudáfrica. Adelante, por favor.
Okay. Can you hear me? Señoras y señores, estimados colegas, buenos días.
Buenos días.
Yo poder participar con una presentación en esta conferencia. Lamentablemente, hoy no puede estar en Guadalajara, pero my Spanish is not very good. It's not good enough for a presentation at a conference. And therefore, I'm afraid I have to switch to English, if you agree. Right, I'll run through the presentation. The presentation is based on joint research with Alicia Jimenez. And we have a project on price and volatility transmission on markets for agricultural commodities. We try to answer the question, what moves prices and what creates volatilities on these markets for agricultural commodities. I'll move on to the next slide. We basically ask 3 kinds of questions. What causes food prices? Is the first question. Second is financialization of commodity markets to blame for the food price crises? And I will present some results, empirical results on that question. The third question is, how are food prices and volatilities transmitted between markets? We actually look at 4 different markets, 2 international markets, the spot market and the futures market. And the domestic markets are the wholesale market and the retail market. In this particular case, the domestic country is Mexico, but I actually look at countries like South Africa and Ukraine as well. The commodities that we analyze are maize or corn, wheat, rice, and soybeans. The next slide shows in a graphical form these 4 markets, the 2 international markets, the spot market and the futures market, and then the domestic markets, the wholesale market and the retail market. Now, for some countries, we have an active futures market, like in the case of South Africa, and then we can study directly the price and volatility links between the two futures markets. But in the case of Mexico, we don't really have an active independent futures market. So the only link to the international markets is via the wholesale market. So directly the link between two spot markets. As you see in this graph, the arrows of influence can go in both directions. So our analysis would leave open the question of how are prices transmitted, in what direction are they transmitted. The next slide gives a motivation about studying the commodity markets for agricultural products. It shows an index of international food prices since 1960, so over the last 75 years or so. And as you see, there are peaks, there are bubbles actually, food price bubbles in the mid-1970s, in the early 1980s, and more recently in 2007 and 8, and then also in 2011 and 12. And as you see, the more recent price peak and hike was as high, if not slightly higher, than in 2008. But when in 2008 and 2007 food prices peaked, there was an uproar. There were protests. Politicians complained. Consumers, food processors complained. So that increased a lot of academic interest as well in food prices. The next slide shows price development of the four commodities that we analyze: maize, rice as a red line, a green line for soybeans, and a black line for wheat. Now, this graph also has a vertical axis in logarithmic scale, which is important because, you know, every time series that you plot should be plotted on a logarithmic scale so that you don't have any distortions. And this actually shows, this graph shows that in relative terms, the food prices in the 1970s was much more severe. You know, the bubble was bigger than the current or the recent bubbles of 2007, 2008, and 2010 and 11. Moving on to the next slide, we presented results of our research at a conference in Guadalajara in November. And I just want to summarize some of the findings that we presented here. I don't want to repeat the results. I don't know whether Roberto Hernandez is in the audience and whether he plans to publish proceedings of that conference and whether our paper would be published in these proceedings. But anyway, very briefly, what our findings were was for maize, the spot market and the futures market move in tandem, both in terms of price changes and in terms of volatilities. For wheat, the futures market drives the spot market. Thirdly, US prices drive Mexican prices for maize. You know, that's where you have a clear price transmission. And finally, in Mexico, you know, when we look at the link between wholesale markets and retail markets, there's price transmission from the wholesale market to the retail market, maize, and here for tortilla. So building on these results, what we want to look at in particular today is the financialization of commodity markets. And that became a big issue in 2008 and 2009 when there was a lot of controversy about the price bubble, the speculative bubble. The fact is that back in the 1990s, financial investors started to discover commodity markets and also the markets for agricultural commodities, and there was massive investment into commodity markets, both futures markets and over-the-counter markets. Between 2003, investment of financial investors into commodity markets, agricultural commodity markets, increased from $15 billion to more than $200 billion in 2008. Now, why did financial investors choose commodity markets? They promised three different sorts of benefits. First of all, like often in finance, there's gains from diversification. And that is so because there's a negative, or there was a negative correlation between commodities and stocks and bond returns. So including commodities into the portfolio of your investment actually promised to reduce the risk of the portfolio. Then investors expected positive returns on investment in commodities. And thirdly, the investment in the commodities was perceived as an inflation hedge. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at commodity index investors. Those investors often chose a benchmark for their investment. They try to invest in a broad range of commodities, and the one of the most popular indices as a benchmark was the index of Goldman Sachs, constructed by Goldman Sachs, and that included three categories of commodities: energy, livestock, agriculture, and metals, as you see here from this table. 2/3 went into energy commodities like oil and gas, about 7% into livestock, more than 15% into agriculture. And these are the commodities that we actually analyze here: wheat, corn, soybeans, cotton, and so on, sugar, coffee, cocoa, but also into metals. Typically, the investment into these commodities went via swap dealers that then who then hedged their positions on the futures market. So they had a short position against these investors and a corresponding long position on the future market, mainly the CBOT, the Chicago Board of Trade. It is typically a passive investment, long-term investment with long positions. So they bought these commodities. And here's the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index as of May 2004. Right, moving on to the next slide, you see here two lines with two separate scales. On the right-hand side, you have the scale for the blue line. The blue line is the futures price, with a peak here. This is based on weekly data from 2006 to the end of 2016. And blue line is the futures price, also with its peak here in 2008. The red line is the number of long positions that commodity index traders held on the CBOT in long positions. And you see here that it's to a large extent a sort of parallel movement. Also, what you see here is that the positions of these investors was not really that passive, because when the market crashed in 2008 and 2009, they actually left the market deserted the market, and therefore the investment was not quite as passive as perceived. Now, moving on to the next slide, the hypothesis that was discussed in 2008, 2009 was, and is still discussed today in the academic literature, is the Masters hypothesis, named after a hedge fund manager, Michael Masters, an American hedge fund manager. Here are some quotes from him. One is the quote from a hearing of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. That's a supervisory agency in the United States for futures markets. At a hearing, he said, Wall Street should be prevented from gambling on hunger. He also said at another Senate hearing in the same year, speculators should never, under any circumstances, represent more than 50% of the total open interest across all trading venues. His point was, like often in financial markets, speculation per se is not a bad thing. Speculation actually can bring liquidity to the market, provide liquidity to hedges. But if the position of speculators becomes too large in relative terms, then they actually absorb liquidity on the market, and they can introduce speculative bubbles that then burst and lead to crises. That's his point. It's all to do with the relative importance, the share of speculators on the market. The second quote is, speculators should ideally be in the range of 25 to 35% of open interest. Open interest is the number of outstanding positions of contracts on the market. And the third quote from this hearing is, it was a hearing at the US Senate in June 2009. If there is too much speculation in the overall derivatives market for a consumable commodity, say 40%, then the individual speculative position limits must be adjusted downward to reduce the overall level of speculation. Now, looking at these quotes, it's not really clear what the critical threshold is in his view, but it's some number between 25% and 50%. And for the results, for our results that I'm going to present now, we use the critical threshold of 35%. Now, the next slide shows, again, the futures price as the blue line, with a scale here on the right-hand side, and as red line, now the relative share of commodity index traders, open interest, the scale here on the left-hand side. And as you can see, the share of speculators of these commodity index traders on the market was often in the range between 50% and 40%, at least in the years up to 2010. More recently, the share was just above 20%. But, taking this Masters hypothesis seriously and trying to find the critical threshold, if the critical threshold is 35%, then there were relatively long periods where this critical threshold was exceeded. So now our question is, well, what happens if this critical threshold is actually exceeded? Do we find evidence for the Masters hypothesis that there's a negative impact of speculators on the market for commodities? In this particular case, it's the wheat market. Let's turn to the next slide then. This slide includes the correlation coefficients between the futures price and the number of positions of long commodity index traders, and that correlation coefficient is 0.413. In brackets is the empirical significance level, so this number is highly significant from a statistical point of view. And when you look at the correlation between the futures price and the percentage position of those commodity index traders, then this is also a very significant number in statistical terms, 0.157. But of course, the point that you can make here, correlation is not equal to causation, and to look at the question of whether we can find any causal links between these two series, the futures price on the one hand side and the position of commodity investors, is analyzed by a Granger causality test, which can run in both directions. Either, and that's the first line of the table, you can have an impact on the speculator's position on the futures price. That's the F statistic. We do an F test here. And the second number in red is the empirical significance level, which is below 5%. So this impact is significant. The impact the other way around, from the futures price to the speculative positions, however, that impact is not significant. You know, the empirical significance level is way above 0.5%. So we actually find empirical evidence here in favor of the master's hypothesis. Moving on to the next slide, we do a more direct test of the master's hypothesis, and this is a simple regression model as with a futures price as the dependent variable. Lag of the futures price, this is weekly data, some 573 observations. The lag of the futures price is also an explanatory variable, and as you can see here, it's highlighted in yellow, and the estimated coefficient relatively close to 1 as expected, positive and highly significant. Then the two variables that we introduce is, first of all, a dummy variable. This critical 35% value takes a value, this dummy variable takes a value of 0 if the share of speculative investors of, these commodity index traders is less than 35%, and the dummy variable is 1 if that percentage is higher than 35%. We expect a positive coefficient for this variable, and indeed we get a positive coefficient of 0.608 or so, and as you can see here, under the probability, in the probability column, this coefficient is statistically significant. So what this coefficient means is that if the share of commodity investors, of speculators, is larger than 35%, then this will increase the futures price by 61.85 cents per bushel, that is. Then we have the percentage of commodity investment traders, long positions, that has a positive coefficient, but this coefficient is not statistically significant. And then finally, we have an interaction term between these two variables. This interaction term is statistically significant, but it has an unexpected negative sign. So we can actually conclude that we do find empirical evidence for the master hypothesis. There's a detrimental effect of these commodity index traders on the futures market for wheat. For the other agricultural commodities markets, we find mixed evidence and not quite as strong evidence as on the wheat market. Right, okay, let's move on to the to the link between the international market and the domestic market. The international market is the US market for maize. We've got white maize here and yellow maize. The American maize price is not for yellow maize. The Mexican price is for maize. But we have the same currency. You know, the American price is converted to Mexican pesos. And when you look at the two price series here that start in 2000 and go on until the end of 2015, it looks as if the American price leads the Mexican price, and that perhaps is also as expected. We presented some evidence on, the analysis of that market. What we want to do now is to actually quantify. We did again range of causality analysis between these two markets, and found a causal impact from the American market to the Mexican market. But what we want to do now is to estimate a model that allows us to quantify this effect. The direction was established, but not the quantification of the effect. And we do that now here starting with this slide that shows the cross correlation between international prices and Mexican prices. On the left-hand side, you see a graph that shows cross-correlation coefficients when it is assumed that the Mexican market leads the American market. These cross-correlation coefficients are relatively close to zero and not statistically significant. However, when we assume that the American market leads the Mexican market, and we allow for lags or leads between 1 month and 12 months. This is monthly data now. We do find a lot of significant positive effects. But to actually quantify these effects, we estimate, and move on to the next slide, we estimate a VAR model that includes 3 variables. The link between American prices for maize and Mexican prices for maize, where the Mexican prices are, of course, denoted in Mexican pesos, that link also has a third component, which is the exchange rate. Given American prices and a depreciation of the Mexican peso against the US dollar, Mexican prices would, ceteris paribus, of course, increase as well. So that's why we bring in the exchange rate here as well. And when we look at we estimate a VAR model, a vector autoregressive model in these 3 variables. And when we plot an impulse response function of a exchange rate shock, which has this standard deviation, we find a positive effect. That's the blue line here, and the 2 red dashed lines show 95% confidence interval. Now, the 95% confidence interval includes the horizontal axis, so the value of 0, and therefore the effects, the positive effects that you find here are not statistically significant. The effect shows when there's a depreciation of the Mexican peso, ceteris paribus, the prices of maize in Mexico will go up. But this effect is not, this positive effect is not statistically significant. Moving on to the next slide, we look at the effect of American prices in dollars to Mexican maize prices in pesos, holding the exchange rate constant. And we find very strong effects, positive effects, from US prices to Mexican prices. In the first 2 months, these effects are not statistically significant, but then they are. No, the confidence interval is here in the positive, completely positive region. So we can actually conclude that if there is a positive price shock in the US, that would be transmitted to the Mexican market. And over a period of 10 months, the price effect would converge to something like 15 centavos. Yeah, 15 centavos. That's the value that we've got here. So just to summarize our brief presentation here, the 3 central findings are: there is some evidence that the position of index traders on the CBOT, the Chicago Board of Trade, increased future prices for wheat. But we have to say that the evidence is not very strong, and it's actually mixed when you look at other commodities, other agricultural commodities. But there's strong evidence of price transmission from US wholesale prices to Mexican wholesale prices for maize. And the exchange rate plays only a minor role in this price transmission. Muchas gracias por su atención.
¿Alguien tendría alguna pregunta?
I don't know whether you want to ask questions now or whether I should wait. Right.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for your very interesting piece of research. It's very provocative indeed. Let me tell you, I was afraid that something was going to happen in this post-NAFTA era. One of your previous findings said that U.S. prices drive Mexican prices in maize.
Yes.
And then the last finding, it says, a positive international price shock leads to an increase of Mexican maize price.
Yes.
So this confirms what I has been afraid since the NAFTA negotiations, that the negotiations were very badly in not only in maize but on 11 agricultural products. I really do not understand, because I had access to the U.S. hearings. One of the negotiators, Serapuche, said, I'm quoting, almost quoting, there are 13 million people in the countryside who are expendable, whatever it means, expendable. So that was terrible. Here is confirmed that the food sovereignty dependency is very high now on the production of United States, and the volatility, I mean the financialization, and any crisis that happen in the United States will immediately have results in the Mexican prices. So after this period, let's move to the next concept. It's really food dependency, food sovereignty, dependency on U.S. Food stock, increasing the food staples, increasing specifically in the case of the maize. Because if that is the case, that will be a very good opportunity now that are talking of negotiations on NAFTA again, to put this straight. You know, at that time, at that time, United States put safeguards on these 11 products, and Mexico didn't. It's amazing what happened, and these are the results. I'm sorry, but my question is, how dependable is the food sovereignty of Mexico according to this trend on prices?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I totally agree with everything that you said. You know, our aim was to actually quantify these effects, which we did by formal econometric modeling. But the real issue is, and I agree with you there very much, is also the regulation of these markets. You know, it is astounding, if not ridiculous, how the markets are regulated or were regulated. You know, I mentioned the swap dealers, and the swap dealers formally hedged the positions that they got from the commodity investment traders, and therefore they were exempt because on formal grounds they were hedgers. They were exempt from position limits that applied to speculators. And that's how speculators, so to speak, through the back door, managed to get into the market and establish huge position. And that really was a scandal. So it is very important that that these markets are tightly regulated. You know, you need to keep an eye on what the financial investors actually do. Thank you.
¿Alguien tiene alguna otra pregunta?
Well, we thank you, Jürgen, for your participation. Great job.
It was a pleasure. It was a great pleasure. And as I said, it's a shame that I can't be in Guadalajara, but I'm looking forward to, and I can't wait to come again. I'm sure I will come this year. But,
we always very happy to have you here.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for you.
Muchas gracias.
Bye-bye, Jürgen. We keep in touch. See you later.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.